All right, it's fabulous to see all of you. I hope you and your families are well and thriving. Tonight, it seems like 100 years, we're going to finally get into the text. It has taken us this much time to prepare for actually reading Nietzsche's text. And there are two reasons for that. One, we needed to have some context for the core ideas that are driving Nietzsche's interpretation and analysis and valorization of Greek tragedy. And two, we have to understand how that's related to his critique of metaphysics. One, because it's critical in the text, and two, we'll also see it in Foucault. And then three, we had to know something about what does that have to do with postmodernism? One, because it's floating around Nietzsche's text, but it's going to become prevalent in Foucault after the midterm. And of course, we had to talk about nominalism, right? And what that is and why it's important. And we had to say a little bit about the Homeric traditions themselves, what we can, and more importantly, what we can't know. And we had to understand the relationship as best we can between the Homeric traditions and the emergence of Greek tragedy. And what that has to do, again, with some of the deeper themes we're always playing with in this course. So we've done that. And now what we're going to do is I'm gonna do a read through again of the attempt at self-criticism fairly quickly, but we're going to identify the core ideas and link them to some of the things we've already talked about. And then we're going to begin chapter 1 of The Birth of Tragedy today. Okay, and so, and once we begin The Birth of Tragedy, we'll start linking the deep ideas that we've been talking about to the text. And we will be also interpreting how Nietzsche's using these terms, the Apollonian, the Dionysian, which at first appear kind of archaic and mysterious, but we can, what's the right word, decode, right, and understand them, okay? So that's where we are. We ready to go? All right, so after all of that, let's walk through the attempt at self-criticism again. What's the project? And remember, what we're reading in the attempt at self-criticism was written actually 17 years after the book was originally published. The Birth of Tragedy was Nietzsche's first book. He was 26 when he wrote it. He was already a young professor, and the book was much anticipated. Nietzsche was already famous at 26. He was already well known intellectually. He was already well celebrated. He was running in the most sophisticated philosophical and cultural circles in Germany. Nietzsche was already a rock star at 26. And The Birth of Tragedy was his first book, and it was eagerly anticipated. And as I've said in passing, it destroyed his career. And we'll talk about that as we get through the book a little bit if we have time. But what we are reading in the attempt at self-criticism is a kind of introduction that Nietzsche writes 17 years after The Birth of Tragedy was originally published, and after the publication of The Birth of Tragedy destroyed his life. Tragedy, right? So the attempt at self-criticism is an older Nietzsche. In fact, when Nietzsche writes the attempt at self-criticism, he's already becoming, and in many ways is, the Nietzsche we know and love. All right, so here we go. The attempt at self-criticism. Page 3. The birth of tragedy out of the spirit of music. We're going to explain all of that, don't worry. Out of music, Nietzsche writes, question mark. Music and tragedy, question mark. The Greeks and the music of tragedy. Greeks and the pessimistic art form. Now, the first thing we've got to just pause right here, okay? And we need to decode, here's the first of the words we have to decode as we get deeper into Nietzsche, is how Nietzsche is using the word pessimism. Okay, first, Nietzsche is not using the word pessimism in the way that you and I currently use it. He is not using the term pessimism in the way that you and I currently use it. When we use the word pessimism, right? When we say Charlie Brown is a pessimist, right? I just watched, it's a great pumpkin Charlie Brown, the Charlie Brown Halloween special, right? And Charlie Brown in our culture, in our time, Charlie Brown's a pessimist. Everything happens to him and it's bad and he's down and he's kind of sad, right? He's a pessimist. If I say I'm a pessimist, it means that I am sad. I see things in a sad way. I see things in an unhappy way. I see things in a depressing way. I'm a pessimist. I don't see the good in anything. I'm a pessimist. I'm sad. I'm depressed. I'm lonely. I'm demure. I'm fatalistic, right? That's how we use the word pessimism, right? Nick Dundy's a pessimist. He's just down all the time. He's sad, he's depressed, he's down. He's Charlie Brown, right? And that's not how that's how we use the word pessimism, but Nietzsche is using it in a kind of earlier way. And that earlier way is the more correct term in the way Nietzsche is using pessimism is, I think, the term we would use is realism. Realism. In fact, if you've had an IR class with Professor Mitchell and you've learned about realism in international relations theory, what is realism in international relations theory? It's one of the main theories of how you interpret the relationship between states, right? And realism as a theory of international relations that is used to interpret and analyze the relationship between nation states. What does it say, right? It says in and of itself, the world is anarchic, right? It has no inherent moral meaning or purpose. It's anarchic. It's without moral purpose. Sounds a little Nietzschean, right? The world in and of itself doesn't have meaning, value, or purpose, right? And not only is it anarchic in this realist sense, right? That it doesn't have an inherent meaning, value, or purpose, but it's also driven by power, right? That if you want to understand the relationship between the great nation states, this is Mersheimer or Morgenthau, or again, if you've taken any Mitchell's classes, you've heard this to Deers, right? That the relationships between nation states are driven by power, right? That there's no naturally existing law, no naturally existing moral order, no naturally existing political institutions, right? This international system is anarchic. It's kind of a state of nature, and the relationship between states is driven by power. And it's constantly in a fight for a balance of power, supremacy of power, right? And that is what Nietzsche means by pessimism, right? He means realism. What we in political science, international relations theory would call realism. And what it means, again, very loosely for Nietzsche, is an understanding of what the cosmos is, how it's ordered, and what life is like. So realism. So when Nietzsche says pessimism, think realism, right? And Nietzsche's saying the cosmos in and of itself, the cosmos and human life has no inherent meaning, value, or purpose. Doesn't, right? It's anarchic in that sense. It's anarchic, right? It's without moral principle. The relationship between human beings or nation states is one of a kind of state of nature, and this kind of attempt, this need to invent meaning and assert it as an assertion of power. And then if you want to analyze the great relationships between nation states, it's a struggle for power. Realists say that the international scene is a struggle for power. Russia and the United States for 50 years engaged in this existential struggle for power called the Cold War, this bipolar order, and it was a struggle for power. It was a zero-sum game, right? And so when Nietzsche uses the word pessimism, He does not mean it the way we mean it, sad, depressed, down, fatalistic, why me? Not at all. He means it in an earlier sense, and the closest to understanding that earlier sense is what we would now call realism. What's the world really like? When realists in international relations say, you know, if you really want to understand the power, the relationship between great states, you got to know what the world's really like. You got to know what people are really like. What's the world really like? Well, the world's really in and of itself. It's really like it has no inherent meaning, value, or purpose. It's real, but there's no moral order. Okay, that's anarchy. Okay, who are the major actors? Individuals. And they're driven by self-interest. And they invent these morals, and they invent these legal and political institutions, and they assert them as acts of power. And then the relationships between human beings are relationships of power, right? They're kind of the power dynamics. All right, and so that's what Nietzsche means by pessimism. When you see the word pessimism, think realism. Right? Do you and I understand the world and human life as it really is? That's what he means. And so he says, the birth of tragedy out of the spirit of music, out of music and tragedy. Greeks and the music of tragedy, Greeks and the pessimistic art form. Tragedy is an art form that tells the truth about the world as it really is. That's what he means. The Greeks and the pessimistic art form. When you see that phrase, this is what he's saying. Tragedy, Greek tragedy, as a worldview, as a set of people who acted in a certain way, this heroic perspective, and the way these people and the type of art they created, in this case, Sophocles' Antigone, right? That is the pessimistic art form. That is a kind of art informed by a sort of a bearing witness of the way the world really is, an understanding of the way the world really is. In and of itself, it does not possess an inherent meaning, value, or purpose. Meaning, value, and purpose is invented. And because it's invented, it's an assertion of power. And there, the great relationships and contests between people is a contest of power. It's agonistic. That's why I keep saying it's agonistic. It's conflictual. It's a contest of power over what things will mean, how things will be valued, and how meaning and value will be directed into the great economic and social and political purposes of human life. That's what he means by the pessimistic art form. And then he says, and this is what he means, and then he says, the most accomplished, right? Because he's valorizing the Greeks of the tragic age, right? He is saying there is something these people knew, and there is something about the way they lived that made them emotionally fierce and intellectually powerful and creative and poetic, aesthetic, right? He is valorizing this. And that's what he says, the most accomplished, the most beautiful, the most universally envied race of human beings, group of human beings, these Greeks of the tragic age, those most capable of seducing us into life. He wants his book to seduce you into a certain way of life. Those most capable of seducing us into life, they were the ones who needed tragedy, who needed it. This is critical, right? This is one of the driving themes of the whole first part of the class, right? There's something that these people knew, and what they knew produced certain kinds of people who were emotionally fierce and intellectually powerful. And they needed tragedy in the sense that they needed a certain perspective, a realist perspective on what the cosmos was like, what life was like, what human life was like, what the purpose of life was. The most accomplished, the most beautiful, the most universally envied race of human beings, those most capable of seducing us into life, they were the ones who needed tragedy, and it's a question mark. Or even more, art. They're the ones that needed art. Right? And again, he's not just talking about art in the sense that he's talking about the Antigone, which he is, but he's also talking about art conceived as a certain way of life. The tragic Greeks understood their lives as an aesthetic, an artistic phenomenon, as an artistic experience. So when he says, or even more art, Greek art, and he's got that question mark, it's playful, he means it in multiple ways simultaneously. The reader might guess, he goes on to say, and now he's going to juxtapose for us the current understanding of pessimism with the way he wants to use it. The reader might guess, Nietzsche writes, where the big question mark of the value of existence was raised. There you go, right? What the big question mark of the value of existence? What's the value of existence? What's the purpose of existence? Is the purpose of existence to discover a moral truth and live according the way Plato teaches, the way Christianity teaches, the way now these sort of enlightenment, normative, social and behavioral medical sciences teach? Is that the value? What's the value of your highest values? Or is the value of your existence to take up the existential responsibility to give your life meaning and value, and to understand the conflictual nature of that, and to fight for that assertion of meaning and value, so nobody oppresses you? The reader might guess where the big question mark of the value of existence was raised. And he says, and he uses the word pessimism in its current sense. Is pessimism inevitably the sign of decline, decadence, waywardness, of enfeebled instincts, as it happens to be with us modern Europeans? Or, he says, going back to how we described the word earlier in its original sense, or, he says, is there a realism of strength? Is there strength in realism? He writes, is there a pessimism of strength? And you can reword that. He says, is there strength in realism? Is there strength in understanding the world as it is, in language as it is, in meaning as it is, in art as it is? Is there a strength in that realism? Is there a strength in that pessimism? Is there a pessimism of strength, an intellect? And the predilection means awareness, and it also means a kind of longing for. A predilection, he writes, is there an intellectual predilection for what is hard, an awareness and a craving for a bearing witness that the world is hard. In and of itself, the world has no inherent meaning or purpose.
Oh, Professor?
Yes?
I'm so sorry to interrupt you. I'm on page 3 and I'm trying to find it, but I can't find where you are. I did see, I find it.
I'm on the bottom of the page. Is there a pessimism of strength? An intellectual predilection for what is hard, terrible, evil, problematic in existence. Arising, and again, this kind of strength that arises from an abundance of health, right? Arising from well-being, overflowing of health, the abundance of existence. And when I say in the past that Nietzsche valorizes the Greeks of the tragic age because he sees them as emotionally strong. He sees them as emotionally fierce, as intellectually creative. They were joyous. Right, and this again, this underlines a kind of theme that we're playing with throughout the entire class. Postmodernism is affirmative. It's joyous. It's intended to be affirmative. It's intended to give you joy. It's intended to seduce you into this kind of abundance And what kind of abundance? This abundant desire to give one's life meaning, to give it value, to resist what oppresses you, to resist what marginalizes you, to resist what names and corners you. Right? This is joyous. Is there an intellectual predilection for what is hard? So understand it. Right? Life is difficult. There's no question about it. And by the way, I don't need to tell you that, you know that. It's difficult. Doing heroic things is difficult. Doing profound things is difficult. Producing art is difficult. Resisting oppression is difficult. All of that is difficult. Political science 471D is difficult. Right? And without being snarky, we can already even juxtapose these questions for us. And without being snarky, honestly, without being snarky, we tend to be a culture of people who want things to be easy. We want things to be quick. We want things to be easy. We want to, I have students in complete sincerity. And again, no snarkiness, no criticism, no nastiness. I'm just telling you, I have students in quite sincerity write me emails before the class and say, do I really need the book for the class? Do I really need to read to do well? Can I just listen to the lectures or take notes? Right? We want things to be easy. We don't want things to be hard. In fact, and in a weird way, we've built a whole culture designed to make life easy. A predilection for what is difficult, problematic in existence. And by the way, do you crave what is challenging? Do you crave what is difficult as a sign that you are strong? Precisely because you are emotionally and physically robust. You are emotionally and physically strong. You're intellectually strong. You crave the challenge. Is it possible to suffer, he writes, from overabundance? And he says, and what he calls for us, what these people, the Greeks of this tragic age, and what he calls for us to know is just attempting and challenging, sharp-eyed courage. Attempting and challenging. Are you willing to tempt great deeds? Are you willing to be challenged? A tempting and challenging, sharp-eyed courage that craves the difficult as one craves the enemy. The worthy enemy against whom you can test your strength. Wishing to learn from it the meaning of fear. What is the meaning for those Greeks of the best, the strongest and the most courageous age of the tragic myth? Right? What is the meaning? What is the meaning for those Greeks of the best, strongest, and most courageous age of the tragic myth? And the tremendous phenomenon of the Dionysian and the tragedy that was born of it. Right? That in those two paragraphs is everything we're going to see. First of all, it's everything we've already seen conceptually, and it's everything we're about to see. Page 7, right in the middle of the page. And in those centuries, the tragic century, probably 550 BC all the way to the execution of Socrates, 150 years. And in those centuries, when the Greek body flourished, when the Greek soul overflowed with life, might paroxysms not have been endemic? Might visions and hallucinations not have been shared by whole communities, by whole cult gatherings? And what if the Greeks, precisely in the abundance of their youth in the tragic age, had the will to tragedy? If they were pessimists, if they understood, they really understood how the world was. If it was madness itself, to use a phrase of Plato's, that brought the greatest blessings upon Greece. Right? It's beautiful. I love that line. If it was madness itself, to use Plato's phrase, that brought the greatest blessings upon Greece. All right. And then, this is both a book about the birth and the death of tragedy. So then, he turns to the death of tragedy. Page 4, back to page 4. And on the other hand, Nietzsche writes, that which brought about the death of tragedy, what destroyed the tragic perspective, what destroyed the heroic perspective, what destroyed tragic art, and that which brought about the death of Socrates, of tragedy, the morality of Socrates, the morality of metaphysics. When he says the Socratism of morality, you can reword it and say the morality of Socrates. And what he means literally is metaphysics, the emergence of metaphysical philosophy, the emergence of metaphysical theology, or the emergence of some type of normative/metaphysical science. The Socratism of morality, the dialectics, modesty, and cheerfulness of theoretical man. Could not that very Socrates, could not the morality and the metaphysics of Socrates, this is what he's saying, could not that very Socrates be a symptom of decline, fatigue, infection, and the anarchical dissolution of the instincts? Right, so again, as we've seen, he sees the emergence of metaphysics as that moment in Western civilization where not only does the tragic perspective die, the heroic perspective dies, but you and I become worse. There's a kind of sickness, a kind of despair, a kind of nihilism that starts to emerge. And might the Greek cheerfulness, metaphysics, that's what he means by Greek cheerfulness, he means Platonic metaphysics. And might the Greek cheerfulness of the later Greeks be nothing but the glow of a sunset? The Epicurean will against pessimism, merely a precaution of the afflicted. And science itself, he says, our own science, our own Enlightenment science, he says, what does all of science mean as a symptom of life? Might the scientific approach be nothing but fear, flight from realism, a subtle form of self-defense against the truth? The idea that the world has no inherent meaning or value, the truth? And morally speaking, something like cowardice and falsehood? Amorally speaking, a piece of cunning. And then he says, oh, Socrates, was that perhaps your secret? Oh, secret ironist, was that perhaps your irony? So in a playful way, he accuses Socrates of knowing that there is no truth, but having to teach it anyways. And we'll see why that is. All right, so let's go now and let's turn to the first chapter. Okay.
Professor?
Yes?
I just want to clarify, because I've been struggling. I think I might have just had a little breakthrough. So what Nietzsche is saying is that the tragic Greeks, because they were aesthetic, creating things, not believing in any inherent meaning, value, and purpose, they were intellectually, emotionally fierce. But with Socrates emerging on the scene and his inherent truth, it caused us to no longer be creative.
Yep.
Which is the death
Perfect.
of tragedy?
Yep.
Okay.
Perfect.
All right.
Can I rephrase that a little bit?
Sure.
Nietzsche will actually argue, and this is kind of caught up in what you were saying, Samantha. It's part of it. Nietzsche will argue that the emergence of Socrates and Plato, the emergence of metaphysical moral philosophy that says that there's an objective truth out there, and we can think about it in terms of concepts like justice or how to live well, and we can think about it in terms of an objective account of human nature, and that the purpose of life is to spend one's life acquiring that knowledge and living that way. Life is a moral experience for Plato. For the Christians, life is a moral experience. Nietzsche will argue that even that emergence, the whole emergence of a kind of moral / metaphysical philosophy, moral / theological religion, that emergence is itself a sign of exhaustion and a sign of weariness. As he says in the attempt at self-criticism, of enfeebled instincts. And what does he mean by simply, and by this is just the first move, we can talk more about it later as we get deeper into the book, but for Nietzsche, the very fact that Socratic philosophy, that moral philosophy emerges in the guise of Socrates and Plato, the very fact that it shows up and it says what it says, hey, there's an objective truth called justice, and there's an objective truth about human nature, and both of those truths have something to do with a moral way of life. In fact, the purpose of life is to acquire knowledge of it and live a certain way. The very fact that that structure of thought emerges for Nietzsche is already a sign that a kind of weariness and an exhaustion and a weakness has emerged. And what is it? What is it a weariness of? What is it a weakness of? What is it an exhaustion of? What weariness of what? Exhaustion about what? Tiredness about what? About living in this heroic way, about bearing witness, recognizing and bearing witness through the course of one's entire life, that in and of itself, the world and life has no inherent meaning, value, and purpose. That if it's gonna have it, it has to, and at one point it had to have been invented and asserted as an act of power, like it was in the Iliad and the Odyssey, and then stylized by the tragic Greeks. And that even when you're doing that, even when you are an Aeschylus and a Sophocles, you're the Greeks of the tragic age, you survived the Persian Wars when you should have not. You're stylizing your own traditions in order to give your time a meaning and a value and direct it into a new purpose. That even when you're doing that, even under the best of circumstances, all of that is kind of fragile because it's always a human invention. Right? And it's fragile in a couple of ways. It's asserted into a world that resists meaning. The world doesn't give a fuck about our meaning. COVID doesn't give a F about science. We can develop our science, we can develop our therapies, we can develop our vaccines, we can develop our cures, and we can do really cool things. And by the way, we should and we must be as acts of human invention and creativity and power. But at the end of the day, we're doing that shit in a world that is fundamentally indifferent to it. And the power, and by the way, this is what Nietzsche will call the Dionysian. The COVID, what we call the virus, is a kind of Dionysian. It's a titanic natural force, which just is. It's just real. We call it this. We diagnose it. We fight it with this. Right? That's fine. That's a great existential agon. But at the end of the day, it's going to win. It is winning. Not just because it's killing people all around the world and we don't have a cure for it, But it's winning because it's shattered economic systems, it's shattered social systems, it's shattered educational systems. And we're in this great agonistic conflict with it. And that's life. And Nietzsche's going to argue that the emergence of Socrates and Plato represents a kind of exhaustion, because from Nietzsche's point of view, his edgy, critical, sharp-eyed point of view, right? He says, well, what does Socrates really tell you? What does Plato really tell you? What do the Christians really tell you? What does Plato actually say? So I'm going to take off my 411 hat. I'll put on my tragedy hat, right? From Nietzsche's point of view, what does Plato really tell you? Socrates comes along, and there's kind of exhaustion from the intensity of this heroic way of life. It's intense. It's hard. It's hard. Bearing existential witness to the fact that you have a responsibility to give your life meaning and value is hard. Did you read the Antigone? If you read it, yes, you would have known that what does Ismene say to that responsibility? She says, no, I'm going to do what I'm told. Antigone says, no, I'm going to, no.
She has a different idea about what
it's hard. Of course it's a different idea. She said no to Creon. Of course. Everything is a different idea. Inside your own mind right now are 100 different ideas that are kind of battling about who you are and what you mean and whether you're beautiful or not, or valuable or not, or whether you have a future. And owning that and recognizing which ideas are oppressive and which ideas are silencing you, and then finding the strength to say no to that. And not just no, but then to reinvent the meaning in the space that the no opens up. Because you can't just say no to what oppresses you. You've got to read. There's a space. Even if you say no to what oppresses you, there's going to be an abyss. Okay, now you've resisted, or you've said no to what oppresses you in terms of how it defines you and values you. But now there's nothing. Now you've got to give that meaning. That's fucking hard. That's not easy. Very few people do it. And what Nietzsche is saying is that, but ultimately what Socrates and Plato, they represent a kind of weariness, because they emerge on the scene and they say, oh, those Greeks, those tragic Greeks, they were wrong. Their myths and their traditions, very interesting, love the plays, super entertaining, but they're objectively untrue and they're dangerous. Don't worry, the cosmos does have an order. The cosmos isn't without order. It's not anarchic, it's archic. The Greek word for order, for moral order, is arche, A-R-C-H-E, arche. That's the Greek word for moral order. Hence the word anarchy, without moral order. And Plato comes along the scene and says, no. The cosmos has an arche, has arche. It has moral order. It's called geometry, Plato said. And not only does the cosmos have arche, order, geometry, the human life has arche. It's got moral order. Because out there is an objectively true definition about what justice is, or what love is, or friendship is. And by the way, you have this special magical thing in your mind called reason that if you become aware of it, lets you become aware of that truth. Oh, and then the purpose of your life is just to go get that moral knowledge and live and just shut the fuck up. Just do what you're told. And for Nietzsche, that represents an exhaustion. That represents people saying, oh, it's too difficult to go on having to invent and assert meaning in this agonistic relationship. And in a weird way, they're right. In a weird way, they're right. By the time you get to be my age, I'm 54, and you've gone through a couple divorces, heartbreak, the deaths of people, your own near death several times, right? And and the struggle, the corporate ladder, and all this fucking shit. You get to a point, oh God, I'm tired. Yeah, someone tell me that there's order and that I just need to act this way and I'll be good. There's something kind of weirdly seductive about that. It's no accident, Nietzsche says, Platonic philosophy is a kind of slave morality. Platonic moral philosophy and Christian theology produces a kind of slave morality. It's morality for slaves. It's morality for people who don't want to think and who don't want to have to bear the responsibility of giving their life meaning and value. Because there you don't have to. There it is. There's God. Here's the book. There's the priest, or there's Plato. Read the damn book. Figure out your nature. Do what you're supposed to do. Your gender norms, your sexual norms, your moral norms, your socioeconomic norms, your political norms, right? Do it. There's order. You want order? There's order. You don't want to think? I will think for you. You want a system? Here's a system. Okay. Back to lecture. All right. So let's turn now to chapter 1. And we are now, here we go, the Apollonian, the Dionysian outline. All right, we're going to find, can I get a woohoo, hooray? We're finally reading the damn book. It's like,
hallelujah.
Yeah, it's like week 100.
I've been having fun.
Are you emotionally fierce yet? All
We're
right.
savages.
Yeah, yes. That makes me so damn happy. Can I tell you yeah, no, later. All right, you ready? Chapter 1. All right, but first I want to set some things up. All right, so here we go. You have heard me say this before. I'm going to say it again in a different way, but formalize it. Okay, so we're going to start the discussion at chapter 1. What's happening in the birth of tragedy in general? Nietzsche will seek to explain the birth of Western civilization. Nietzsche will seek to interpret is a better word. Let me wipe out explain and put interpret. Nietzsche will seek to interpret the birth of Western civilization and hence seek to explain the origin of tragic drama through a sort of artistic or fanciful reading of Greek history from Homer to Greek tragedy. All right, so when you look at the birth of tragedy, what's really going on, right? What's kind of Nietzsche doing in the book? And he's going to tell a story, and it's literally his interpretation, right? Nietzsche makes no pretense to the idea that his account or his story about the time between the Homeric traditions and Greek tragedy is the objectively correct one. Nietzsche's telling you a story. Nietzsche's telling you an interpretive story. In fact, he as he says, as to kind of riff off what Samantha was saying, so far, ever since Plato, ever since Socrates and Plato, we've only heard how many interpretations of the kind of role and importance of Greek life from the Homeric traditions to Greek tragedy. How many interpretations have we heard about that? Ever since Plato, basically. One. Right, we've heard one. Right, Socrates and Plato emerge, right? And they say, hey, an objective truth exists. It kind of has a moral orientation. Human beings are rational. Therefore, the Homeric traditions, objectively true or objectively false? False. And in a way, kind of dangerous. And Greek tragedy, they're myths. Right? Plato calls them myths. And ever since Plato, That is how Western civilization has generally, in a cultural sort of way, viewed the Greeks before philosophy. Right? Yeah, and again, to be sure, we still read the Iliad and the Odyssey, of course. We still go on date night and go catch a modern interpretation of Sophocles' Antigone or Prometheus Bound by Aeschylus. Yeah, we get dressed up, have some champagne, go to date night, and we have a great time. Hopefully, it's a great play. But we look at it all as just kind of entertainment or mythological. We don't take it as a worldview. We don't take it seriously. And so Nietzsche is going to say, hey, let me give you another interpretation of the time from the Homeric traditions, whenever that was, because we don't know, and the emergence of Greek tragedy. Let me tell you a different interpretation. Let me tell you a different story about that and why that's important and why you may want to pay attention to that. So contrary to the standard interpretation of Greek history that reads in that history this idea that the Homeric traditions and the Greek tragedy were somehow myths, and juxtaposed to the objective truth, somehow inferior and not to be taken seriously, Nietzsche's going to argue just the opposite. Greek tragedy represents a comprehensive worldview. It produced emotionally fierce and intellectually powerful people, and it produced the most powerful and seductive actual pieces of art ever produced, the Antigone. Because that art told you the truth about what life is. Greek tragedy, the Antigone, tells you the truth about what the world really is. And it does it in a beautiful way. That's its power. Right? For Nietzsche, the Antigone tells you what the world and life and the struggle for meaning and love really is, hence pessimism, really. Right? The Antigone tells you how the world and how the struggle for meaning and how the struggle for value and power, how the world really is. And it's heavy. It's heavy. Because the world has no inherent meaning and order. The meaning and order has to be invented. And it has to be asserted as an act of power. And those different assertions of meaning and value as assertions of power are going to come into conflict with other people. Right? Both Creon and then Antigone are right. And sometimes it's going to end in death. It's going to end tragically. But Antigone goes out heroically. And that's it. Are you Antigone or are you Ismene? And for Nietzsche, the actual play tells you that heaviness. It illuminates that existential responsibility, but it does so beautifully that the actual tragedy is beautiful. It is sublime. It is joyous. Again, joyous. There's a joy in this recognition of what the world is and what life is and how meaning is generated and how value is generated. There's joy. There's exuberance. There's a kind of intoxication about that. So Greek tragedy for Nietzsche, just speaking about it on the level of the art, the Antigone as a play, it's a tragedy written by human beings, reimagined from Homeric themes, conveying this kind of heroic conflict over the need to assert meaning, in this case, what the gods expect, and to do it, and to bear that responsibility and to die knowing you're doing this. Which again, forgive me, I really think I'm losing my mind. Now I'm being sincere, I'm not just being idiotic. Because for me, as we talk about this, and I think about it, and I think about what we're talking about in multiple levels, in Nietzsche's analysis of tragic Greeks, of the power, the sublime power of the actual tragedy itself, Sophocles' activity, and even our lives. Like you know this, as we talked about last Thursday, and I feel stupid because I keep repeating it. This is happening in your life. You're living in Thebes. Thousands of you, hundreds of you right now, you students, are out there on the streets saying to Creon, racial injustice, economic injustice, police fucking brutality, saying to Creon, fuck you, enough. And it's dangerous. Some of you are left on the fucking field. So this isn't abstract. This class isn't abstract. Nietzsche's analysis of what the hell is going on isn't abstract. What Antigone said to Creon, it's not abstract. You're fucking living it. Pardon my language. And you're doing it because it's heroic. And you're doing it because it has to be done. Because you can't be as many anymore. You can't say, yeah, well, that's just the way it is. Power's power. And the dude, you know, the man's the man. Can't fight the man. Can't fight City Hall. Right? You're doing it because you're not saying that anymore. You get it. You're Nietzschean. This is what Nietzsche's talking about. You understand it. And you understand that it's dangerous. It's dangerous to your pride. It's dangerous. Maybe you get hurt. There are people in Belarus disappearing right now. There are people in protests that have been killed. Some tools plotted to kidnap Governor fucking what, Michigan? Again, not that I'm celebrating that, but it's conflict over meaning. It was dangerous. And it's heroic. And sometimes it hurts. Right? You don't know if you're coming back. How can you know? You can't know. And again, now I'm going to lose my job. I'm going to lose my job in the other class too. But I can't ask you to read. I can't assign this book. I can't ask you to read this book or do political philosophy in general or read Nietzsche and make it safe, make it okay. It's impossible. And anybody who tells you that it's possible is lying to you. They're lying to you. And then you better ask yourself the question, why are they lying to me? So you know this. On every level. All right, so we know what Nietzsche's going to do in The Birth of Tragedy. Nietzsche's going to tell us a different story about the time between the emergence of the Iliad and the Odyssey and Greek tragedy, and why that time and the people that lived it and the art they created was powerful. Because so far, like I said, the only other story we've been given about that time comes from who? Comes from Plato. Those Greeks before philosophy, they were interesting people, no doubt, and they fought in the Persian Wars, no doubt, all that's great, but they were just wrong. They were myths, not to be taken seriously. Or the Christians, just call them all pagans. They're all people who lived before we knew about Jesus. So they're all just pagans. Now the scientists, they weren't very mentally healthy people. Okay. All right, we have a story about him. Now Nietzsche's given us another one. All right. Now, I want to talk about this briefly because we've been using these terms. What Nietzsche's doing in the book is giving us a different story about the time between the Homeric traditions and Greek tragedy, and that if I had to give a phrase to describe what kind of story it is, it's kind of clumsy, but I would call it existential aesthetics. Let me type this up for you. And by the way, it's in your outline. Nietzsche's kind of narrative could be called a kind of existential aesthetics, right? And why? What would be two kind of big clumsy words, existentialism and aesthetics, and I'm throwing them together to make even a more ugly and confusing word. So why the hell am I doing that? Because it helps us just to remember where we are. So the birth of tragedy could be interpreted, Nietzsche's story, Nietzsche's interpretation, his poem of a poem, his narrative could be called a kind of existential aesthetics. Now, why? Why existential aesthetics? So first, again, another way of saying something we've already played with. For Nietzsche, in and of itself, the world and human life has no inherent meaning or value or purpose. Okay, it's fine. So whatever meaning or value or purpose it has was at some point and still is a human invention. Right? And so existentialism means, what does existentialism mean? Existentialism is a very general philosophical term for the idea that meaning derives from existence. Meaning derives from existence. That's what existentialism means. Existence. It comes from the German word existence, the French word existence. It's existence. What is existence? Just mean I'm here, I'm alive, I'm being. And meaning derives from being. Meaning doesn't derive from outside of being. Meaning derives from existence. I'm existing right now. Meaning derives from existence. That's what, at its most basic, that's what existentialism means. Meaning derives from existence. Right? And so for Nietzsche, as we know, right? Because in and of itself, the world has no inherent meaning, value, purpose. So that means whatever meaning, value, and purpose it does have comes from existence. Whose existence? Human existence. So for Nietzsche, all meaning, value, and purpose derive from existence itself. All meaning, value, and purpose derives from existence itself. Right? And this makes sense, right? Because for Nietzsche, there are no metaphysical or universal truths that explain, justify, or guide human activity, right? So to be an existentialist means that you have a kind of responsibility to give meaning and value and purpose from your existence to your life, right? That's what it means, right? You and I have a kind of responsibility to give that meaning and to give that value and to sustain it for as long as we can. That's what existentialism is. All meaning, value, and purpose derives from existence itself, right? And if there was a kind of morale, that's not right word, but if there was a kind of responsibility associated with existentialism, it would be becoming aware, right? That I kind of have this responsibility by virtue of existing, not by virtue of nature, not by virtue of God, not by virtue of some genetic disposition. I exist, and because I exist, I have this responsibility to give it meaning, because I'm aware, because I'm a nominalist, that it may not have it in and of itself. And so if I'm going to do things and do powerful things, beautiful things, erotic things, I got to give it meaning. And that meaning's got to derive from my existence. And not only does it have to derive from my existence, but then I've got to give that existence meaning. All right, so that's what existentialism means. Now, what does aesthetics mean? Right? And again, as Samantha asked earlier, aesthetics is the term for art, right? For Nietzsche, since there is no metaphysical meaning, so no pre-given laws, moral laws, or universal languages, right? All meaning that derives from existence is artificial. It's a human invention. It's art. It is literally art. And that's what the term aesthetics means. Aesthetics is a kind of general term for art. If something is aesthetic, it is in its essence artistic, it's aesthetic, right? It's something that has meaning or value or purpose as a human invention, as a form of human creativity. It's aesthetics. So literally, for Nietzsche, mind and identity and subjectivity and life itself is an aesthetic experience. It is not a moral experience. For Nietzsche, consciousness and subjectivity, personality, and life itself is an aesthetic experience. It's an artistic experience. Think of your consciousness in an aesthetic way, Nietzsche's going to say. Foucault's going to become famous for saying this. Foucault is going to say, think of the body aesthetically. Don't think the body and sexuality as something moral and objective in terms of gender assignments and what the natural gendered body does with itself sexually and morally. Don't think of it like that. Think of the body aesthetically. Think of morality as aesthetics. Think of law as aesthetics. Think of politics as aesthetics. Okay. So Nietzsche is asking us to do a kind of existential aesthetics. In fact, what he does in The Birth of Tragedy could be defined as a kind of existential aesthetics. One which he's going to suggest is extraordinarily powerful, Greek tragedy. So, existential aesthetics, and this is my definition, existential aesthetics for Nietzsche is making beauty, giving meaning to, and making beauty out of what is unintelligible and can't be mastered. Let me repeat. And by the way, so it's right there on your outline. So the way that I define existential aesthetics, my definition, if I had to invent a definition of existential aesthetics, this is my definition. Giving meaning to and making beauty out of. Giving meaning to and making beauty out of, deriving beauty out of what is unintelligible, the cosmos and human life, and what can't be mastered. We will never master the Dionysian cosmos and our language, and we'll never master our own death. So existential aesthetics is giving meaning to and making beauty out of what is unintelligible, but doesn't have meaning in the big scheme of things, and can't be mastered. And that is going to be literally what Nietzsche means by the Apollonian and the Dionysian. So for Nietzsche and Foucault, for postmodernism, art, aesthetics, and not moral philosophy. Art and not moral philosophy becomes the preeminent way of understanding and interpreting the mystery and the potential glory of an individual life and culture. And of course, for Nietzsche, the supreme expression of this existential and aesthetic way of life is found in tragic drama, in Greek tragedy, especially that of Sophocles and Aeschylus. Okay. And it's written right here for you. As we will see, tragedy, the Antigone, tragic drama, does this through its ability to incorporate the power and the potential chaos of the world into an art form that serves human purposes and glory. And again, tragic drama combines the recognition of what I write here, the chaos of the world, or the recognition that in and of itself, the world has no inherent meaning, value, or purpose, right? Tragic drama combines the recognition of the kind of the nothingness of the world and sometimes the chaos of the world, the COVID of our time, right? Tragic drama combines the awareness of that and the human desire to bring order to that chaos through language, through meaning, through value and purpose that are human creations. All right, let's go ahead and stop there. And on Thursday, we go directly into the Apollonian and the Dionysian, and we operationalize all these themes. All right, we good?
Thank you, Professor.
Good. Thank you, Professor.
Thank you.
Yep.
Good.
Great
Thank you,
job,
Dan.
you guys. Very proud of you. We're getting there.
Thank you.
We're getting there.
Professor, I know I thought I was lost because I
Thank
was
you.
looking at the 3 on top of the page instead of the 3 in the bottom.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah, I was like, why? I'm looking at the 3rd and I can't find it. I was so confused. And then I have a question. So on the outline, we are at the Homeric myths and emergence of a tragic perspective, right?
No,
Apologian.
no, we're on a totally different outline, Jennifer. We're on the Apollonian, the Dionysian outline.
Oh, that's why I don't think I have it.
Yep, you should. It's on the Canvas page.
Yeah. Okay, so the ones that we already finished with the major course things, that was long time, and then we already finished the Homeric myths. It was like
Yep.
September 29th, because I have the dates here when I was writing them.
Well,
Okay, that's why it makes more sense. I'm sorry.
Okay.
Yeah, that's why I was feeling a little lost. I'm gonna look for it. Thank you.
okay, all right.